welcome. Here as the policy committee. And so I'd like to call that to order, seeing we're all present. Judy, Dave, myself. First thing is approve the agenda.
I so move.
Second. Favor?
Aye.
With that, I don't see that we have any public comments.
We
I
had
have one
one,
that I forward to all of you.
there was one submitted regarding the flag policy that was submitted electronically.
Correct.
And that was a repeat. He just resent it, didn't he? Yeah.
Acknowledge that. With that, we'll move on to reviews. Series 200 policies.
All right. One of the things that we're gonna do here tonight, and I'll look for your feedback on, is kind of the process for how we review an entire series at one time. Judy was part of the process a year and a half ago or so when we approved the 100 series. So we're following a very similar type process, just to kind of give you a little bit of a background as far as what's occurred. We worked with the School Board Association, and Attorney Dan Mallon was kind of our representative who worked with us. And he did a review of our 200 series, and then also compared our policies with regards to what they call their policy resource guide, which is kind of model policies along pretty common lines that school districts have policies on. So our policy book aligned very similar to what they had. What Dan also looked for was any places we had gaps, any places that we had a policy that we really didn't need that we could get rid of because of either old legislation, old language, or just kind of being encumbered into something else. He combined a few policies, and then he's obviously added some that we didn't have here as well. So what you see in front of you is, first of all, this was the spreadsheet Rebecca put together. And what this articulates, and she'll hand it out here in paper so you can see it. And I think it was included in your packet as well. It just walks through really what occurred with each of our series of policies. And it's kind of color coded, and it looks at like what the action was. If it was a new policy, if it was amended, if it was retained or replaced. So you can kind of see the whole kind of history of what's going on. I think overall, after we went through it with Dan from the School Board Association, Rebecca and I sat down with Ted and we went through the policies just at a high level to see if there was anything that really jumped out or some things we wanted to clarify. I think we've tried to address some of the things that we discussed, Ted, within kind of the drafts we have in front of you. Then Rebecca and I went back through them, and I included Brian Grabarski, who provided just some insight into current practices. So those are reflected in here as well. There's a few policies that as we go through, I highlighted that I want to have some feedback on. For example, the one on district administrator, professional development and travel. Give you some, I'll kind of give you how that impacts me, but also something to be thinking about for the future. And it's really a direction that can go either way, but I think we should talk about it first. There may be others like that as well. So what Rebecca and I thought we would do tonight is we're going to just bring them up one at a time, and we're going to scroll through them, take them at the top. And if there are questions about any of these, we'll take notes, try to answer those. If there's modifications, we'll then kind of update those moving forward. At the end, after we're through here, the question we'll have is, do you want to move these forward to, are they in a close enough proximity to what you're looking for to move them onto the board with the modifications that you request here tonight? Or do you want to have another meeting before you move them onto the board? So there's a lot here. So this is kind of a process for us to see what's going to work best. So starting off with policy 210, this is with regards to administrator goals. I mean, as I looked through it, there was nothing that jumped out at me that was concerning. But if there's anything that the committee has.
I just noticed that in the first paragraph, when they talked about that they'll be hiring with commitment to non-discrimination and equal opportunity, if that doesn't meet one of the goals that the DEI had, is that a strong enough language?
It's probably legal language.
Yeah.
It's a non-discrimination clause. It's really what it is. So this is on, you're on.
I'm on 221, page 1.
Yep, we're going to start on 210 here.
Oh,
We're just gonna go one at a time, Rachel. Oops, sorry.
and this, I guess I didn't print that many.
That's all right. You'll see them up on the screen here. So they'll all be there. So 210 was the one that just articulates administrative goals. So are there any questions or thoughts on that one? I thought it would just presented them in a relatively straightforward way. Nothing in there gave me any concern. Dave, anything on that?
Nope.
Okay. All right, now you're over to 221.1. Was that where?
Yeah.
This was the next one that we were looking at.
Yeah, and that's where my first paragraph where I said, non, like you said, it's legal. But I think that's what we're committed to.
Right.
So I think that's good.
Yeah, I mean, I think that line in there is certainly a piece that lines up with non-discrimination laws. So that's part of why that's there.
I just wanted to ask, and I think I'm clear, but the blue language in parentheses, like editor's notes and stuff like that, that's from WC.
That's
Yeah.
from WASD. Yeah, that's just some things to kind of give us some guidance, and then we kept it in there so you could read it. But when the policy actually moves forward, we remove all that. That's not part of it. That's just editor's notes. Yeah, thank you. This is one that we had Brian kind of review. So I'm just going to scroll here. I mean, one of the things we had options on was unless the board directs otherwise in connection with a specific position opening, the superintendent and director of human resource shall define and oversee the implementation of the practices and procedures for recruitment, et cetera. So this is actually recruitment of administrative staff. That's what Brian and I do. So that lined up with the policy as it was written. It just articulated that the HR director and myself, we looked at what the process is. And so we asked him to look at it from that lens.
Are you putting in that one or more board members will be part of the committee or not?
That's in item 7, I believe.
Yeah,
You
Yeah.
scroll to the next page.
yeah, that's down here.
Mhm. Are we doing that just on a anyway, or this is now kind of codifying it?
This is what it's.
I think that's in their actual language, wasn't it?
Yeah, this was actually part of the option we had there.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the one thing we've had conversations about is which positions is the board involved with. And I think what we had talked about was any of the positions that were tied specifically to like a committee or at the level working specifically with the board. So any of our director level positions. So that's why we have in the process for principals and directors. So when we hire like an assistant principal, the board hasn't been part of those, but any of the other ones that specifically have been, we've included them. That answer your question, Judy?
Yeah, it does.
Any other questions on that policy? Okay, no. All right.
I'm good.
Anything else? Dave? All right. 221.1 rule. Well, this is just deals with conditional offers of employment, and Brian again went through here and made sure that it lines up with what our practices are. So this is when we're actually offering a position to somebody.
I'm wondering in our structure, who would fall under that desired, if desired language? Managerial position that doesn't hold an administrative contract.
IT facilities. So some of those. don't.
IT facilities don't have administrative
They
contracts.
have administrator contracts as determined by state statute. So you have ones that, so there's certain positions that have to have a license, everything, and other pieces, others would not.
But based on how we operate those people, maybe we should use that language.
Sure.
because they operate just about the same
They
as
do.
the
Yeah,
administrators.
11824 is actually the statute that talks about administrative contracts.
Do you run administrative contracts on them? Right now?
We
Or how do you
we
do it?
don't run them under 11824. They're under, they have a little bit different language and protections. Right. So they're not under the same language. So this is specifically to the state statute language, is really what this is talking about.
So what would be the change if we did that? Significant or meaningful?
Except for the desired rule, also applies to managerial.
I mean, operationally, they seem to operate the same.
No, there's absolutely no reason not to put that language in there, Dave. So if you like this, it just means that we operate in the same.
Yeah.
You just keep the second line. I have no problem. It's really how we operate with all of our positions, whether it's a teacher's position where we have a contract or an administrator piece, they're operate pretty similar. So keeping that does not give me any issue at all.
So keep the underlined portion.
Yep.
Well, added.
Yeah, you just added in. Yep, that's fine. Is that any other ones on 221.1? So the change we'll make is we'll keep the underlined portion that applies to the people who do not hold a contract under 11824.
Any other questions about?
Ryan went through this one as well, and
Yes.
I think what he changed. This is just really dealing with administrator contracts and some of the timing for non-renewal purposes.
So you're going from a month to 6 months.
Right, that's statutory language. So 6 months, in order to, this is non-renewal, so if you wanted to remove an administrator in the midst of their contract, so they have a 2-year contract, it's a year in, you want to remove it, you have to give statutorily 6 months notice.
How much time do we have to give a teacher?
It's whatever is put in there for, I don't know that off the top of my head, there is statutory language for that. as
I'm
well.
just wondering why the legislature changed it. Curious, but no big deal. Statutory is not what they're doing.
I think that's generally what it's done. So that's why you have that, because right now our contracts go from July 1st to June 30th. So the non-renewal of them.
So we should probably find that out.
Yeah, we can look that up.
For me, it's just a matter of curiosity.
Yeah.
But it's
So
not
you're
like we can do anything about it anyway.
Figured
No,
it out.
it's statutory.
Because when you look at like the statutory language about like when we have to extend contracts, so that's like, they've changed that now. I think it's in April. But we can I can just get that information for you so that you're familiar with what it is. Very good. Anything else for 222?
Nope. Not for me.
223, this is one I go back and forth on. So this is one I need some feedback on. This is really with regards to 223 and 223 rule. It's really with regards to kind of like my professional development, and some of those pieces and how you want to go about approval of those. particularly as I look at really the first page, unless you have questions on it, that one really doesn't give me any, I don't have any questions with regards to that. The second part, it's on page 2, then I guess my question comes in, and it's kind of that piece, it's what we went through and just lined it out. But I guess after we did that, I just wanted to get your feedback on it. This is a piece we've talked about generally at my eval every year, is just kind of what are the things that are coming up. But we've never really put together kind of what's your professional development plan that you want for to kind of present to the board. So that's really what that language that I lined out includes. If it's something that you would like in there, there's certainly not an issue with that. But then I was looking at it in relation to 223 Rule 1, which is really related to kind of when you get into like your approvals and kind of where those pieces fall. I think you need to look at and consider this one from a perspective of, I don't travel a lot in my role. I mean, personally, I choose not to. I go to my WASDA conferences, which are in the fall and the spring. I go to the legal conference once a year, and I go to the School Boards Association. And then usually a couple times a year, I do something where it includes something that we have a group of staff going to. And I go there to accompany them on some of those. So that's usually the extent of where I've gone. I'm not someone who goes to the national conventions. But I think you need to look at this from a lens of this policy is probably going to be here after I'm not. And I do have colleagues that travel extensively. So I think it's one that you may want to look at and say, how do you want to kind of pre-plan, I guess? Do you want to have something where I would present annually to you, kind of what my professional development plan is? And then associatively, take a look at kind of the requirements for activities, travel, approvals on 223 rule. So those are the ones I guess I'm looking. I can operate either way. One puts quite a few more hoops to move through. I'm not opposed to that, but it's a piece I guess I wanted to get your feedback on.
What do we do now for a budget for administrative? And is the administrative professional development one budget for all of them? Or
This is
one?
just, this particular policy is just for superintendent.
Okay, so there's a budget for that?
You and I share a budget, the board and I, so we have a
Oh,
budget
that
that we hold.
The one I pay for the chairs.
Yeah, yes, that's the one. So we have a budget in my office, that's really the superintendent's office and the board. So when you go to state convention, it comes out of that account. When I go to like my legal conference in the summer, or I go to superintendent's conference in the spring or fall, that's where it comes out. So you have to have funds in there in order to travel. So there has to be budgetary dollars for it. It's not like if there was anything extra, you'd have to ask for that. This is really more about approvals. I mean, right now there's, since I don't really travel extensively, there isn't really an approval process that I go through. Joan, as a board president, doesn't sign off on anything. I usually try to let you know through my correspondence where I'm going.
So the president does sign off on it? Is that?
No.
Doesn't sign.
Yeah, so right now we don't really have a process where that happens. This kind of gets a little bit more specific as far as when something needs approval. If I travel out of state, I believe those are ones that I'd let you know. I think I've only done that a couple of times, and that's usually with those PLC conferences to Chicago. National conventions I haven't traveled to, so.
If we're looking at the difference between the policy and the rule, is the policy the general what you're going to do, and
Right.
the rule is the
Yeah,
application.
the rule is, yeah, great clarification. The rule is kind of your procedures.
And as long as you're staying within the budget we have, I mean, if you were going,
Right.
to China for an, it might cost us more.
Right. Correct. Yeah, generally, I think when I read through these, it just puts a lot of language to a lot of people. Most of them, I don't need to get a lot of prior approval for because they don't meet all those criteria. So,
Do you see any controversial topics? I mean, it's offered by institutions of higher education. It could be kind of anything. I mean, now there's a lot of things that are probably really heated.
right.
But you're asking, maybe we should have this in for future superintendents.
My guess is you're not gonna go through the 200s again for a lot, so, but I think it's worthy to have in there, just so that it's clear. I think part of it is kind of what you want, and maybe you don't need all the nuance of 223 if you have an approved upon annual plan on the second page of 223. Maybe you don't need the rule if you have the professional development plan on right there. Or you have that plan, but you also have an approval process for when you are moving. To me, it really
Seems like
doesn't.
you need one or the other.
That's what I would say.
What do you, I always like to keep all employee groups as even as possible.
Yeah.
What do you do for your administrators underneath you? Is there a policy of how they have to get approval?
Mainly if they're traveling, most of them are traveling to like their principals association groups. There is a process that they have to put in. If they go to a national convention, we have that we keep in our office. Every 2 years, they're eligible by contract to do that. But then they have parameters and an approval process to submit to you.
Or wouldn't we just do something similar, except again, it'd be the board president versus you,
Sure.
and just at a different level, but that way everything's.
Right, so anything that like my principals, when they go to their fall conference, they just inform me that they're going, but it's not that there's anything that I'm approving. It's part of their professional organization. If it's something where it's like a national organization that they're going to New Orleans for the conference, that's a piece that I done. And there's a process for all of that.
I mean, but let's take a look at it also from practicality. Which would you rather be? What's easier, doing an annual plan
It's
or
better
getting
doing,
approval when you go somewhere?
better doing an annual plan. I just think it's a piece that you then just have. What I like, as I thought about it after we crossed it out, the annual plan at least allows you to kind of communicate generally where you're going. And then if something comes up, you can just communicate that to the board. And then if there's something outside of that, national travel, et cetera, I think those are pieces that you can, I think we need approval for those anyway. I think we could probably keep that piece in and maybe not have the rule. Which is generally, I think, what he was putting here. Under the blue part, it is a school board and district owner may wish to consider supplementing this section of the policy with the rule that further defines mutual expectations of the district administrator, such as identifying certain time-intensive or high-cost activities for which the district administrator is expected to get advanced approval.
I mean, it seems like either one of them works.
Yeah.
One of them is probably a lot more work per item.
Right.
The other one is work on an annual basis.
Right. I think that's pretty simple. So I would say we should probably maybe unstrike this part, Rebecca. That would be my recommendation. And then
I mean, don't you see deviations probably within the year though that you're going to then probably follow up with that sort of process, you know?
It's- Yeah, it does say at least annually, so he could
Do it more
come
often.
in 4 months later with a modification.
right.
And I would think
But
we
it's
got
still
rid of the
short.
rule. If we had problems down the road, we could always clarify and go back in.
Yeah.
If we had somebody who seemed to be taking advantage of.
I think starting there is a good place. They start off with an approved piece. We can also maybe even add language that if it changes, you need to inform the board. I'm speaking to this from someone that can probably lay out my travel plans for multiple years in advance.
That's you, Rebecca, right?
I just don't travel a lot. It's harder to travel than to be here sometimes.
So we won't have rule. the
I would
rule
say
then.
you would just get rid of the rule unless there's a reason you'd like. But we'll back reinsert the. that section. 224 is this board superintendent roles and working relationships. And I read through that, there was nothing that jumped out at me. That was
When they refer to the leadership team, that means you and the board, that's the team.
Correct.
Okay.
That's the words that they believe they were using here. But when I read through that, I think that's pretty straightforward.
Mhm.
With that one?
Yeah.
Okay. 225. This is the eval of me. What's one you say?
Yeah,
224 rule. Oh, that's still your working relationships with the board.
Well, it's rural one for.
It's just kind of outlining kind of expectations, like the superintendent will be prepared for board meetings. Once the board's decision is made, we'll follow through with it. It's kind of just walking through. These are kind of just more clearly articulated expectations of working with the board.
Um,
That's really what the rules are.
no, I didn't understand number 3 of the rule, the first section there.
Okay, the superintendent shall exercise sound professional judgment and identifying issues, incidents of it. We need to be aware and decide when and how to. So if something happens that I need to let you know about, I have the sound judgment to figure out what those are.
What
I
it
need to
is.
give you a call, send you a message, call a special board meeting, determining how to appropriately communicate that to the board. So a lot of times I'll update you by email. If something's pressing, I'll give you a call. So this is just really kind of talking about kind of the more
Well, and
what
then,
actually happened.
and then number 2 of the board, the board should use its authority as a governing body to limit and diffuse actions by individual board members that contravene the will of the board. I'm wondering how you do that. I mean, that's kind of like we're sanctioning our own.
Collectively goes back to all of us. Say, I mean, yeah.
Do I speak up and say you're out of line at a board meeting then?
Or that someone's upset about a decision.
Yeah, so that would be in a situation where you voted as a board and now somebody on the board would be out
Oh, talking against it.
talking against it, and you kind of have a working agreement here that that you support decisions moving forward.
That's what we should be doing, but not that we're going to enforce it.
Yeah, number 2 sounds, I'm not sure legally how that even works. I
We
mean,
agree,
I
we agree
get
to
it.
abide by the majority, and then when we don't do it,
Yeah, but you don't have any authority to limit an individual board member. I'm not sure what authority they're talking about. I mean,
Clarification on that.
does the board have an authority to,
to limit and diffuse actions.
yeah, what does that mean? I mean, I've seen the free speech cases about joint boards and the ability of individuals to speak that they disagreed with the decision. So I'm wondering what authority they're referring to here.
I think it's giving it back to the board to say, okay, collectively, you guys got to talk about this and come up with a solution to it.
I guess the board could make a public statement that that individual members, what, the infamous letter of reprimand?
Yes. No, and I can ask that question. I'm meeting with Dan here shortly, so I can come back to that one and ask that specific question as far as what were they looking at as far as what is the authority.
And what is it you do to limit a defensive action?
Right. That's fair enough. Okay, on to the next one, Rebecca. This one's with regards to evaluation. that the language you have there? On
We
the
usually don't complete it until almost end of February, don't we?
I think that's what we were, April. I
Right,
think that's what we were talking about is the time.
right.
So
So it gives you, or another time consistent with the kind. Basically, the thing you have to take a look at is when you do the eval, unless you're going through non-renewals, really is kind of up to the board. That's kind of what that language is about, or another time consistent with the superintendent's current contract. If you're going to non-renewal and the eval is something that you need to have, then there's pieces that you have to have all that done 6 months prior. I don't think there's anything here that precludes you, is my read, in my view, that precludes you from doing something sooner.
No, it just says normally expects.
Correct.
Big deal.
So to me, this language generally fits in with what we're doing. We were just talking about this today at the January meeting. We'll be setting out our kind of timeline for board and superintendent eval. We used to do it kind of in the January timeframe. But I think what we've done recently is it's kind of been more towards the April-ish timeframe so that some of the goals could kind of be more, you get a more true accurate piece of where we are with regards to the goals that the board set prior to May.
And you complete it before the board members turn over to the
Yes,
election.
Right.
you get the tools in January and February, you complete them in February and March. And then you actually do the eval in April.
Would we be better than having the language say something like, the board normally expects to begin an evaluation of the superintendent by no later than January and complete it by no later than April?
Yeah.
Because this makes it seems like we should be done in January.
Okay.
And maybe that would be more consistent with what we've actually been doing for years. I just seems all my time on board, it's always been starting January, end it around April.
Yeah.
I
As long
seem
as
to be
it's-
writing them in February.
As long as it's not too condensed, I mean, at least
Yeah.
you're leeway.
And again, it says normally expects, doesn't mean
Has
has
to
to be
be.
done. But I think we should at least make it clear that we're not expecting to ever complete in January.
And I think there's also a piece in here stating to make sure that it's completed before the new board is seated.
That's in there?
No, I wasn't sure that as a
I
note.
didn't think so, yeah.
But I think that's been kind of one of our goals. That's one of the objectives that we've had. That's been important, is trying to get it completed by the folks who worked that year with the superintendent. So that it's done before that turnover of the board and the. Okay. This is something I generally have done, I believe, maybe.
Yeah.
Which is I bring something to the board. I usually do it in closed session and I give an update on how the rest of our administrative team is doing. So that I don't see as that's similar to what we're already doing. So, to me, that one is fine. Next item, Rebecca, we actually took out, because I think in policy, they have an exhibit, which is an exhibit of my eval. We actually took that out.
Do you want me to bring it up in the old stuff or no?
No, I don't think so.
Are you just thinking you want that exhibit back in there?
We're thinking we don't want it in there because it's something that's been kind of changing and evolving as opposed to having something in
So
policy.
you don't want to have to change policy every single time.
Correct.
just because you
Yeah,
change
because
it.
the
Yeah.
board has gone through that. They've reviewed it every year and they've made a few changes as we've gone through. So I don't think it should be in here in policy. So that exhibit 225, that would not be there. 230, Rebecca? Oops. I think this is just talking about school administration authorities. This one's pretty straightforward as I read through it. I think it makes sense. this is one, and this is one, Ted, I realize that you and I talked a little bit about, I didn't add anything to it. This just gives some general guidelines as far as when you might consider like an assistant principal at a building. It's a relatively old policy. You can see it was in 1999. Generally, I think it's relatively close to what we've taken a look at, but I think as I was talking to Ted, there's probably also other factors that play into it as far as it is hard to kind of narrow down as far as from a policy perspective. It could be just needs of students, it could be needs of programs, it could be some of those type of things. So even though it serves as a guide, it's not like once you hit 400 at an elementary school that it automatically prompts you to be hiring a principal. It's kind of meant as just a guide to kind of give you some idea of when you should be at least starting to look for other administration at your building. I kind of like it in there just from the standpoint, it does give us some guidance. We do have language around like class sizes. So this is kind of the equivalent of the administrative class size piece as far as when you add somebody else.
Maybe we ought to have a broader term in there then, because the board may choose to provide additional administrative support during periods of transition on a part. I mean, it just seems so not acknowledging that you can have the pressures that you mentioned.
Right.
I'd like that spelled out a little bit more.
Okay.
You know, we certainly had times when you needed, you have an influx of transition kids and.
And we've certainly done things where, I don't know if we've done it in my time here, but when you looked at additional adding staff as you kind of are going through referendum planning, some of those type of things, we've doubled up or done some things. We've done a few things with the last referendum in 2014 where we did add some of our administrative staff before the move took place, partially driven by numbers and needs of kids, but also to help with that planning of the referendum and that process going forward. So I think there's a few pieces of language we could add to here, but otherwise
some
I think
cushion
it's
so that the board could say,
generally still
yeah,
relatively
based on that.
accurate.
It's just the wording where it says maximum range, no maximum. It's more like a general range, you know, but general doesn't
Yeah.
work.
Yeah.
You could just get rid of that, just say range of
know.
students.
Just,
I know.
just,
Across the
I
board.
like that. It's just a range of students. Yep. Yeah. The next one is 253, policy implementation and compliance. My view is relatively straightforward. This is really just about how do you get a policy responsibility for reviewing them, and then also responsibility for implementing them as they put forth. 253 and 253.1. 253 is talking about policy compliance. Let's just stick there. Any questions about that one? Okay. 253.1 is talking about administrative rules. This is really stating, well, now you have a policy, kind of how are you implementing things? In many respects, what I see that this one relates very closely to like student handbooks. So if you think about like if you have a policy on student discipline, you might have more specific things about dress code or other things within a procedure. So administrative rules are things that are just about how we're going about doing. How do we improve professional development? How do we implement the discipline policy? It's more of how to. states that we have the ability to do that in line with the policy.
I don't disagree with one and two about how it's written up and how it's created, and that it's the superintendent's responsibility. But like you say about the student handbook and the employee handbook, on number 3, where it talks about having new rules come up, that they may be presented to the board just for informational purposes. I wonder, would there be some value in having it say that they will be, for informational purposes, be presented to the board? Not that the board votes on them, but that they're presented that way. It's in the public domain, just like the employee handbook and the student handbook. No one can say that, well, how did that secretly show up?
So instead of
I'm
may,
just-
you say will be presented.
Yes, I would change it to will. And again, for informational purposes or input, but just so that it always comes out publicly. No one can complain later that that was a stealth move of some sort that nobody knew about. Does that seem reasonable? or-
I think
Is
as
that
long
too much?
as long as what we're looking at are kind of like those written rules. I mean, when you look at the operations of a principal, there's not every single rule is documented.
Right.
So there's a lot of things that are just the practice and the culture of a building. You're talking about things that are written rules. We already have pieces for employee handbooks. If anything that's changed, that has to come back to the board. All this would stay as long as it was any administrative written rules would come back, would be if we had some sort of like a student handbook or something that we were going to implement something differently. We could just bring that back from information. That's what you're
Yes.
talking about.
But that last paragraph gives us an out that everything that we reserve the right to review, modify, suspend, or revoke any rule.
Yeah, that becomes a question again of, you can't review and modify a rule you never heard of. You know what I mean? By the time, it just, we've seen that enough where suddenly the rule comes out, the damage is done and everybody's upset about it, but nobody had heard about it.
Yeah.
Until too late.
I would just add in there that it's
That it will.
the written rules. It's
Yeah.
those more formalized written pieces.
Right.
You know, if something gets changed, we bring that back.
I'm not even sure technically what that would apply to.
Probably most likely apply if there was something that we wrote in like a student handbook that we changed from like, that would be something. I don't know what it would apply to yet either.
Yeah.
But that's what jumps to mind is where we have more written rules.
Yeah, definitely something along those lines.
Yeah.
But I'm not exactly.
I can look at that. The employee handbook one, which is the next policy, that already has that language as part of it, and that's part of our practice.
I don't understand what number 3 is. Neither the employee handbook as a whole or any specific provision within the handbook. And then number 3 under that. I don't understand that. Yep, that one right there.
Okay. One of the things that you had when there was a contract, and particularly under some of the collective bargaining stuff, was that there was a property interest. Otherwise, you had a property interest, it's legal terms, for your position.
Oh,
So what this is stating is that these are handbooks, but they don't create a property interest for, that has legal meaning
okay.
in the issues of renewal and non-renewal.
So it doesn't really apply since we don't have. a
Well, it
contract.
does. It's just stating that this handbook does not create a property
Okay.
interest. It needs to be stated that way.
Okay.
The other pieces here, I believe we follow as far as how we bring things back to the board.
What's the reasoning under that yellow change? I assume that's additional language.
The board alone.
That isn't their current.
Rejecting proposed amendment. I think that's just a piece that's was highlighted as an option that you have. That it's generally that the things will come back to the board if at any point we added something to the handbook that you gave me authority to modify without coming back to the board, that you could designate those sections.
Is that something new? or is that current?
That's not, we don't currently have that, nor has the board given me any authority to modify any part.
So is this just WASD boiler language?
Yeah. It's basically saying you're gonna approve the handbook, but if you want to designate, the board may designate a part of it that could be for the administration to have authority over. Right now, there is no authority, but we bring the whole thing back. So if that's kind of a piece for the future, if you ever wanted to have that ability, you can do so.
I gotta say, I'm not a fan of that. Just, I think we gotta take the hit if we change the rules for the employees or students. That we shouldn't. I don't know. I'm not sure.
Doesn't,
Where
where
this
this
would-
anyway, isn't it saying like, without this in there, we kind of say, hey, you gotta go back and change it and then come back to it?
Yeah, well, right now, the way it operates is kind of without that language. If we're gonna change anything with regards to a handbook, it cannot go into effect until it comes back to the body. So that's what our current practice is. So this is this language WASB put in there stating if there's any part in the future that you wanted to say this section 10 really has more administrative authority, and if you have a change to it, you don't have to bring it back. I think the board could probably do that without it being in policy. So I don't have a problem taking.
Yeah, I think you could probably do it because it's not banned from doing that.
Right.
I don't think it's a great idea, again, due to the public. Putting it in the public realm before you create new employee rules is, in my mind, a good idea.
I don't mind taking it out. It's not our current practice, and I'm not sure where it would. I think you could have the board, if there was a section that we were saying, it's in transition and you administratively can modify that as it goes through, you could probably designate that in your motion as you.
And then it would be public record.
Right.
So then you don't probably need it to be in. I'm okay taking it out.
I don't mind it taking it out.
All right, that's fine. Anything else on that item?
Nope.
253.3. The language I added at the very bottom was student handbook will be approved by the board annually at or before the regular August board meeting. That's generally when we do it. So that was language that the last sentence is a piece I added. And when you kind of look at those administrative rules that kind of fall, a lot of those, the written rules primarily fall within those student handbooks. To me, this is fine. Questions on that one? 254, Rebecca. I think the only change we had here was the district's current job description shall be accessible through the district's website. So that's just the 1, 2, 3, 4th area down. Were some options there as far as like a handbook of any sort. Our handbook is all electronic right now. $260. I think the piece that we talked about here, this is really temporary administrative arrangements. So for example, I think the area that we made a few changes to were in the event of an unexpected vacancy or temporary absence that exceeds or is expected to exceed 2 weeks, that we may bring somebody in for supervisory help. So that's an example of like we've had Greg Ely's been helping out at Heritage this fall when Dan was out with his knee surgery. So that was an example of how we've utilized that authority in the past and how we continue to do it. Generally, I think what we do is we I think we put 2 weeks in there just as a marker. I think what we would do is administratively, and the way that was, if you'd implement is we kind of assess kind of what's the true length of absence and what are the needs of the school. But that gives us at least some options there for how we can move forward. Then the second part, we tried to clarify was at the bottom here. I think Brian added this, I'm sorry, right there. No, he didn't. I don't think he added it in here. And all the files. All the funded for designate. Oh, he did. But I think what we did here is when all of the following apply, the board designates. Basically, our executive director of operations is the person who would be available if I'm not available. So if that would be, in this case, it would be Steve. If Steve were not available, and of who is the third, this was the piece we wanted to add in here. I'm not sure if that added was, then it would be just like I did when I was out here in November. If I was out and Steve were out, then I would designate the 2 people in curriculum and instruction. So in this case, Tim and Amy, who oversee elementary and secondary, to be the people who would oversee the instructional side and the student and parent side. And then HR director would then be in charge of overseeing the operational parts. So that's a piece, I apologize, that wasn't clearly articulated here. So in the absence, I'm not available, it goes to the executive director of operations. In the event that we're both gone, then I would split it up just how it's I. That was the question you and I talked about, is who's the third?
Mhm.
Everybody comfortable with that?
Yeah.
That change? $262. I think he wanted to remove it. And as Rebecca and I went through it, I think one of the pieces that, at least from my time here, hearing from the boards, I think generally what this states is that we're going to collaborate where possible with members of our staff. And I think that's just generally just kind of a good statement from the board.
Do we have a committee handbook?
No.
So we've kind of skipped paragraph 3.
I didn't read that part.
I was gonna say, I don't think I've ever seen a committee.
No, we don't have a committee yet. The part I was really looking at,
But maybe we should.
it's really is in the development of rules, regulations, and procedures, the superintendent shall include at the planning stage whenever possible employees who are affected. That's been kind of a standing expectation of the district, and I thought to just remove it. But a committee handbook, I mean, to be honest, we do have committees, but I don't know if there's a handbook that really is needed for that. It's maybe a piece that we need to articulate what some of our committees are.
I know Brian Hafer has been pushing that each committee should have a mission statement of some form.
But this isn't board of them.
Right,
This is not.
but I would think it would be helpful, especially in a transitional period, if there was ever a reason for a transition, to actually have something like that for committees, so that the next person coming in isn't guessing what that committee was.
But isn't
But I'm
that,
saying board committee should have it too. We don't.
but shouldn't this be the purview of the superintendent to decide what committees he wants and for what purpose? I would think that would be the administration.
No, I think that, yeah, he should do it. I'm just saying for the purpose of continuity beyond the current superintendent, it would make sense that if you're going to create a committee, there should be some sort of statement as to what it is. And right now, we don't have that at the board level either. We should have it at our level too. I mean, we've kicked that goals committee into
But
8 million
don't
different
you
tools.
think that the superintendent create his own committees? Why does he have to carry over the ones that the former?
I think he's
No,
just saying.
but he
wants
at
to
least
state
knows
and
what they
clarify
were
what
and
that
why.
committee
There's,
does.
there's merit.
You could
to what-
delete them if you felt like it.
There's
but-
merit to what this is, because I mean, Joan and I and Brian Kotarski meet with our WTA every month. One of the things they asked us was, who is the membership of our, kind of our standing committees that are operating across the district? So when you have like the leadership team that the board works with on budget, when we have our calendar committee, insurance committee, who are the memberships of those? So there is merit to kind of creating a structure that would articulate what our general standing committees are and who our membership is. So to me, I'm okay with that. But I brought this policy back really for the second paragraph. But what you added, Dave, I have no problem making sure.
So you want to keep that line or you want to get rid of it?
The center one?
Yeah.
I want to keep it. No, WASB was getting rid of this whole policy.
Oh,
I brought it back because I felt when I read through this one, this seems to be kind of really a strong statement that our board has always wanted to do. And I thought to lose that wasn't really in the spirit of, I think, how you normally operate. So I thought from at least a communication standpoint, that was an important policy to have.
it's been revised so recently.
Yeah. That's a piece that I think it's been referenced a few times that this is something that we value. It's more of a value statement piece.
Mhm.
That comes to the end of it. Well, I think what we could do, Ted, is you've obviously given me some feedback on a few of these to rewrite and to add some pieces to. Well, there's two options. One, you could ask for these to come back to the committee and we could review them before they go to the board. Or you could approve them with the modifications that you've recommended. And then Rebecca and I will have those done and bring them to the full board in January. These I would recommend probably going through a 2 reading process where they get reviewed at the January meeting and then voted on in February. It's not required by policy, but I think we've got it when we have something that's that in that large.
Well, I would think if you brought it rewritten to the January board, we could have read it beforehand, and if we didn't agree with the
Right.
changes, we would speak up then, as opposed to delaying it another one of our meetings.
Agreed. I mean, I don't see anything as urgent in this 200 series. That's causing any issues.
No.
We do have some other issues that, but I don't have any problem with that.
So
Yeah,
I
go
think
either
we need a
way.
motion from the
I
committee. then
make a
to move
motion
it
that you
forward
make
with
the-
these changes.
The changes and present it to the board, the next full board meeting for a first review.
Do we have a second? for that?
Second.
All in favor?
All right.
Aye.
All right.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, just as a piece real quickly before we go on, I am meeting with Dan Mallon, I believe it's this week. Or it might be right after break.
I think we're
And what we're gonna be doing is then moving ahead with kind of planning out what our next steps are. Because I've worked through the 100 series and the 200 series. One of the things that we've committed to partnering with the WSB on and purchasing is their policy resource guide, and then working with Dan to kind of work through the rest of our series. So this is probably a couple-year process, but we'll take the next series. And I'll evaluate if there's one series that we need to take earlier than another. I know some of my staff have asked me to do the 400 series next, because they know that there's some revisions that they want to see there. And then once we get the 200 series approved, we'll get the next series coming in front of the committee. So this committee will be relatively active as a result of that.
Thanks, Randy.
You bet.
Next up, number 5 is the flag policy discussion input. So coming out of the last one, we discussed, I guess, 3 possibilities with regards to the flag policy, saying we don't currently have one. We can continue to do something like that, not have one, and have issues like this come up.
Right.
Third one is to what they've done here, or second one is to come up with what's done here. Let's try to establish a policy and give some criteria, at least have a discussion around this is what it could possibly be, to put some guidelines down. So you want to go through what you have?
Yeah, so what I did was I took, I think generally some of the feedback we talked about last time. At the last meeting, we reviewed a number of policies that we had from around the country. I think there was one from Canada, some universities. Also, Brian Hafer had gone through and kind of written up some things that he had seen or was this kind of recording as part of his process as far as thinking about this. And I took all of those and tried to just combine them. Because I think what the committee asked for last time was what would a draft policy look like that had some of the different provisions in it and had a flag kind of a request process. So the general pieces here are just trying to define what are some of the flags, what are some of the pieces that go along with etiquette of the flag, some of the pieces like such as half masting of the flag, identification of a commemorative flag, and then if you were going to fly a flag other than the U.S. and Wisconsin flag, what does that process look like? So that's generally what I did, was combine pieces, and then I used one of the sample policies had a request process, and we modified that. I think generally what I heard from the committee last time was wanting to make sure that there was ample time for consideration of any commemorative flags. It needed to hit the board 2 months in advance. This process that I laid out here just kind of pulled from some of the language of that it needs to come from a board member 2 months prior. There has to be an actual picture of the flag or description of it. Identify generally what we have, that we're talking about the flag poles outside of our buildings. That's generally what I did, Ted, was just combine things that we had from previous policies and try to incorporate the thoughts that we had at the last meeting. I think this is going to be one that's probably going to require us to have a little bit more discussion on and reflection on, and then probably another iteration coming back as opposed to trying to move it too quickly. But I wanted to at least have something in front of you to respond to that we can discuss.
I liked it. Do you really say that it has to be brought forward by a board member? Is that
That's
the
what
only-
well, there were different pieces in there, and I didn't write down what we talked about last time, but that was part of a couple of the policies that I reviewed, and I believe that was also, that's kind of what our current practice has done. Not necessarily that's how it had to be, but it was coming forward through a board member. Doesn't mean somebody couldn't, from the community, couldn't contact the board member of forwarding it.
Yeah,
But for this purpose, and at least for this initial draft, that's how it was written.
because you'd have to have at least one person that wants to put it forward themselves then? Is that what we're
I
gonna
think
narrow it down to?
based on how I've seen this done other places, what'll happen is, the concept is, it cuts down on, I don't want to say frivolous, but excessive requests to do something if you authorize it to be from anybody. Does that prevent anyone from making requests? No, you just have to convince a board member
At
to
least one
carry
person
that
to carry
request
it.
for you. But it's a way to cut down on a lot of requests.
And I guess my concern was, as I brought up on the last one, I don't know how you make some, so the request form is fine. I don't know how you get objective analysis of how do you approve or not approve one. And for any of these cases, that's where I really struggle with.
So the describing the purpose of the flag display, how it demonstrates interest and how it aligns with the district priorities, they have to spell that out, but you're still saying that's a judgment call on our part?
Most things are a judgment call, right? And
Yeah.
we talked about politics now, pretty much everything's political. And so it depends on what the climate is and what's going on, and then now it's policy, or it's approved, and it's, our whole timeline of what that is, as it go on in the future. That's kind of how it is right now with the 3 we have approved to be flying.
Well, the board could always make a motion and remove one. There's nothing precluding that in the future.
And this one does have a start and end date on it, so it isn't in perpetuity.
Oh, I
Doesn't
think
mean-
they meant by the start and end date of when you fly it. Not necessarily that it, well, we approve this for 3 years and then it ends.
Oh, I
think
thought you'd have to get it approved every year, so it's not like every January you can't fly some flag because you got it approved once. I thought it had to come before.
I think
Oh, that's what we've been doing that's what we've done so far.
It's been going on,
Ah.
so
So
it's
far
approved, it's
what
kind of
we've-
done unless it's brought back up, because now that's been approved.
So
And
far
like
what's
Dave
been
said, you
brought-
can call it back It's like,
what's been brought forward as the motions on the last few, it's been part of a resolution that state, and part of the motion states that every June from this point forward, we will fly the pride flag. Or every November, we would do a Ho Chunk flag or the Juneteenth flag in February. So those resolutions have stated that we're approving it to be done every.
Perpetuity.
Yeah, and I think what this is stating at least, and I think you can articulate it how you want, but I think it's stating like June 1st to June X date is when this would actually fly. But then I think part of the policy you have to think about is how often do these requests have to come back? Is it an annual request? Is it something that once it's approved, now that's what we're doing? The other piece that as I was going through here, is it does talk about a commemorative flag being in, flown and displayed on a flagpole. Question would be, what is the things that would be, what does that allow or preclude from being in a classroom?
That definitely came up in, was it Waukesha last week?
Right, so I think that's a piece that as we look at this, we need to clarify that too. For example, you could have.
Yeah,
You
two
could have the
areas.
pride flag in June, but you may also have a teacher who has that. Is that allowed? Is that, and that's a piece that Ted, you and I talked about, is one of the policies or discussions I want to have here is also, what are some of those kind of, where does speech go as far as what you can personally display within the classroom? Maybe not from an instructional standpoint particularly, but from just a personal belief standpoint. And I think as we go into a political season, we have to have that conversation at some point. But that's a different conversation than we're having here, but it has a little bit of crossover as I was reading through some of the language was, if you're articulating it specifically for a flagpole, what does that mean if somebody has it in their classroom?
yeah, and I'd definitely have to keep them probably separate. I
Correct.
mean, because it would really muddy this one and
Right.
that other, I mean, there's a lot
Yeah,
of things.
so
with
this
that.
would have to be just specifically the flagpole piece.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and there isn't, is there a thing where it's going to be displayed? Like, I only want it at Heritage, or I'm asking for it at one of the schools or all of the schools too?
It's a good thing right now.
I think you could articulate that here. I mean, right now we have one flagpole at every building. Except for this building does not have one. You also have flagpoles, like at the high school, you have flagpoles at like all of the athletic fields. So there's different poles where the flag is displayed there. So I think what we're talking about here is the main flagpole at the school as opposed to others.
So do we want to separate it from the building flagpole first?
I think that already is.
I think
separate.
that's
We're
a-
just
Yeah,
talking-
that's what's just gonna
That's
be
just,
about.
that's what this is.
That's
okay.
what this is, but that's a good point, that it's definitely gonna, that should be
Main
something
one.
to be addressed as well.
I think the most important language as we consider this is that the purpose of a commemorative flag is about bringing attention to something that affects the students. As far as, if you scroll down just a little bit or back up a little bit, I'm sorry. Okay, that first paragraph there on that page is that supports or aligns with promoting a safe and inclusive learning and working environment for the students and staff. I'm a little bit up and down about the community member part because we're the school district. We're not the village of Waunakee. And we should be concerned with the environment within the schools. While we affect the environment of the community, that shouldn't be the driving force for something like this. It should be about our students, how they feel within their school building. And I just think that when I consider the ones we've looked at in the concept going in the future, to me, that's the driving idea, is making sure that all students feel that it's recognized, safe and inclusive for whatever that representation was.
Does that mean the absence of it is that we're not that way?
Not necessarily, but
It shouldn't be provoking.
And
That could be
that's
too.
how you call, yeah. That is different to everyone, right? So that's, I think,
Mhm.
a real tough one.
I mean,
It's still a hot potato.
yeah, we're not probably gonna see a motion to put up a Confederate flag next week. Or the flag of Mexico.
I've already
or
heard though
whatever.
for community value flag, I don't know what that looks
The
like.
what flag?
A family values flag?
I don't recognize what that is, but
I don't either. but
they-
there was a
luckily
name.
they have to provide a picture. So if a board member wants to make,
But exactly, then it opens that up and maybe they'll come up with their own, and well, it fit what you're calling for. It definitely promotes safety, and so then it really gets into something that could be played with it. You got the US flag, you got the state flag, they both represent something of significance for our country and our state. You know, we're citizens of this country and we're residents of this state, and then it's like commemoratives on a school flagpole. I get that it's, I don't, it just muddies waters.
well, that would be a reason to vote against any specific motion. I mean, I guess you could try to vote against the policy with the idea of banning them all the time, no matter what. Would be the other version, but then in which case you'd have to create a policy stating that
No commemorative.
no
flag.
more commemorative flags at any time for any reason. I mean,
You know,
that's the other version.
If you're looking at the values of the United States and Wisconsin, they have everybody's liberties and freedoms within those flags. Don't they?
Yeah.
Can't everybody find a home within the US flag?
I would hope so.
All right. You would hope so, but
Legally,
there are
legally
definitely,
they should.
there are definitely some people and students and groups that feel that they have not always been well represented by the American flag. And while we may say today they always are and stuff like that, there have definitely been times in the past where they haven't been. I mean, I don't want to get into history lessons.
No,
but
I guess I want to work to bring everybody under the American flag as opposed to,
And these flags are under the American flag. I think if you look at, well, you know, we have our Wisconsin state legislature just recently, and a Republican legislature passed the thing about Native American history. So that's why we came up with the Ho Chunk flag, that was part of moving that along. I mean, it
but
was
is it
passed for
Native
a reason.
American history in the curriculum pushing that or?
What was the requirement? I can't remember the exact wording of it. But a requirement of Native American history in school.
But that's what I mean. I think that's where we're pushing to have more inclusive and making sure we lift all these groups that have been overlooked before. We're doing it through curriculum, we're doing it through other things, and I don't necessarily see putting a flag up to do it is less effective than putting it in the curriculum.
And that's an opinion, and I agree with it. I mean, people will have opinions the other way too.
Yeah,
But that's,
yeah.
I would agree because it takes away from, in my opinion, what that flagpole represents, so. I know that other people totally don't think that's the case.
Yeah, I personally think that it's part of that process. It's not an only step. And putting it in curriculum isn't an only step because depending on the teacher in the classroom, it's going to be a little bit different each place. This is a
process.
way to bring awareness that we are putting it in the curriculum so that it creates the discussion. But I mean, again, each flag as it comes forward is going to be a motion and a vote at that time. And as we've said, you can always go back and rescind one just as easily as you created it.
I think one of the questions that I would want to have clarification on before we would vote on anything is, as we look at, if we went this direction and if we had a flag request,
Mhm.
is there any sort of discriminatory legal issue with voting one up and one down? I just I have to answer that question, because when you start looking at the piece about shall support and align with Waunakee School District policies and promote a safe and exclusive learning environment for all students, staff, and community. Does a statement like that create a situation where what does that look like if you vote something down?
That's exactly my
That-
point.
that's
If you
the
don't
question I
have
was gonna
objective
ask.
criteria for what that is,
Right.
that-
Are we
everything
gonna
is
talk to
subjective.
Strang about that?
That's probably where I would start, or I'd probably start with the school board association person. Too. But that's one I just gotta at least know what the parameters are. It's really not an issue when you put one up, it's probably more of an issue when
When
you
you
vote one
deny one.
down. And you've approved certain ones, and what's your criteria? That's kind of the piece that I just gotta have clarity on.
I'd be interested when you talk with them too, about the screening process for it and how that impacts it. Not just voting up and down, but how did you get to that decision? What would prevent you from ending up in a problem?
Yeah.
This is getting closer to what we want, but we still have some issues.
So it looks like you'll take this back to.
I'll take that back. I'll talk, is there anything, I want to get that question answered,
Mhm.
particularly given the conversation we were just having, and then bring that piece back. Anything else language wise in here that you want? That this was truly kind of a pull together of multiple things. So I
Yeah.
guess I would ask between now and the next meeting, just take a look at that closely.
I would think the only other thing I would be looking at is, like I said at the end there, about a screening process. What is the steps, once you have the request, to getting it in front of the board before a vote? Because I don't expect 7 board members to know exactly the impact and understanding of all of that. We should have a little deeper process than that.
And I assumed that it was only a request for one request. It isn't in perpetuity. And so if that's not the truth, I mean, that's not.
So you
good.
think it's a yearly request?
When I read this, that's what I thought it was gonna be.
I think that would be almost more trouble.
I think it would too.
To have to
but-
drag it back every single year.
I think that's just a piece we need to talk about. If you're gonna forward a policy like this forward, we're gonna need to decide how that's articulated.
Yeah, yeah.
Or it's for an X period of time, or
Yeah, we need to articulate that.
that's. Yep.
Oh,
About the 2 months prior to the flag display date. So if we want to display a flag June 1st, we have to vote on it at a meeting. That means we're really like 3 months. before, because we don't have our meetings on the 1st. It seems like it's, the ones that we have voted on really have never been that far in advance. Like, I would like to shorten that time, so maybe it would be 2 meetings before.
I think that was the general thought, was that it kind of had to go through 2 readings of the board.
But that would still make it 3
It's
months.
2 months, but it would have to be presented. So if you wanted to fly it June 1st, you'd have to present it in April and May in order for it to fly into June meeting.
I think that is the intent, but I don't think that wording is what it says.
Right.
Okay.
So I guess, Joan, from your perspective, you're okay with kind of 2 board meetings?
2
or
board
readings?
meetings.
Yep,
So,
yep. I'll look at that.
Yeah.
All right, good.
moving on to 6, review of board policy related to public records, policy 823. Been included here. This really came up from a request from a concerned citizen. I think really feeling that related to this policy, since it's there's been some discriminatory nature that's been taking place in how open record requests have been handled. And so we this is the policy that we have in place right now, dealing with that, and really, let's see, do we have that coming up? Hold on.
The current policy is quite vague with regards to just talking about access to public records. Public records actually is a large statutory aspect, which is what you see attached as a sample policy, or actually multiple policies, or a policy with several rules behind it and exhibits that would show you kind of just the depth of what public records request, what some of the legal aspects of it are. I think the sample policy clearly articulates really what's required from a requesting standpoint, and then what's the duty of the school records officer, which in this case is me.
And so in this case, I think the request was made, there were several items requested, most of which, almost all of which were provided, and one was not. And then it was the belief that that was denied. And the criteria for that denial wasn't really up to snuff, or I didn't believe so. That's really where it comes into play here.
I would agree with that assessment, Ted. I think that the concern that was received, that there was one part of a request that was not provided. And then the response that I provided in my written response did not go into rhyme and verse as far as the why. I think that's probably a piece that should have been more robust in my answer. In a follow-up correspondence, we did go into more specifics as far as why that wasn't provided.
And I believe this requested, so the one piece that wasn't provided was actually reviewed and was looked at.
Right.
Not only by yourself, it was looked at by the attorney.
Yeah, let me walk through kind of what I do for public records requests, and then let me talk a little bit about the policy. I think it's a good idea to review the policy. When I receive a public records, and I look, I think I've received 25, 26 in the last 18 months, this records request. Some of them are relatively simple. They're asking for one thing or something relatively easy to provide. I received one this past week. That's kind of ones we would receive on an annual basis. It was from another, it was from an attorney who represented a group of employees from another district. And all they wanted to see was our salary schedules and our job description. So they records requested us for that. I think Rebecca and I probably turned it around in about 10 minutes. There wasn't a long description written for it. It was just, here's the records you requested. If you have any questions or if we missed something, let us know. They respond, thank you. This is what we're looking for. So that's one level of it. Other ones are more in depth, where you have to do some assessment as far as, one, is there a record that exists? Two, how do we access that record? And then three, how are we going to provide that? Some of these are also, when they're requests, particularly if they include things like an email request, and it's a piece I need to work with our IT department. A simple search of any of our emails on a keyword pulls up multiple things for various reasons. But needing to go through those and make sure that the things that we're releasing are generally releasable items. So for example, if somebody were to, let's pick on Ted for a second, did a records request of Ted's email, and within there was a piece that a teacher just was emailing him about one of his kids and emailed it to his school account. Obviously, that's now a pupil record. That's not something I'm going to provide. So in many of like the email requests, I want to go through and make sure that none of those things get inadvertently shared. So part of the email piece that in question was a significant number of keyword searches. We went through and reviewed those, and then we released those. The other pieces involve some aspects of social media. I do involve our attorney on these items to make sure that I am interpreting what I need to review as a record and what I need to generally release. And if there's ones that I have a question, I talk that through with him. In the case that you're talking about, Ted, that was those accounts were provided to him to take a look at. As far as if they were all open to the public, to generally give a review as far as which ones fit within the criteria of being either a record we held or a record that it could be assumed that we held, and then for it to be released. So that was generally the process we went through. Everything was released except for one item. And then that's an area that I should have put forth more detailed description for why that wasn't provided. In a subsequent request from this individual, then I did provide that, and that's what I shared with this committee. So I think a piece from that respect, that was a process to follow. I will admit that I should have had more details to the why. I still believe it was the right response.
And I did, so from that, I spoke with Dan Mellon regarding this issue as well, and he said, you know, content is kind of everything. It isn't so much that what it is in terms of a private, I don't think I'm incorrect in what I'm saying, but they're private, like if you have a private email and what you talk about back and forth, you might be venting to some of your family members about work or something like that. Even though it's work related, that does not mean in your private account that it's now a public record. And it's
Just
those
because
type
I
of things,
commented. on it.
just because I commented on it. And I think maybe I'm interpreting from that this record was given to be reviewed, and it was something like that, where, yeah, maybe this was happening, but it had nothing to do with correspondence and work. That would be my interpretation.
That was our assessment, similar analysis. Yeah, it's also a record that I don't necessarily hold.
Correct. You
So
know,
that's
so
the
we
piece
can't
that I
turn
don't
over
hold.
something.
So I can't
No,
release
that's the way I understood it. We don't know.
So, I mean, certainly there's I think there's two pieces. There's kind of the nuances of that. And when you talk to our attorney about like public records, I mean, his analogy to me was, it seems like it's a real simple 2 + 2 = 4 when actually public records is a calculus issue. Because there's so many different pieces that you need to look through to determine what's a record, and then some of the nuances as far as which ones are released, particularly as we move beyond just paper records, which were pretty easy to figure out if you had them or not. But particularly as you move into kind of the world of things being more electronic and some of those aspects, there's definitely some pieces that have to be kind of vetted through. That's what I did with our attorney before responding to that.
It did seem like part of this, though, comes down to a staff person in one capacity or another, talking to people in their position as a staff person, talking about activities that they have or will be doing, and then informing people of that. For example, a teacher telling 2 or 3 parents what's happening in the classroom, or a coach talking to 4 or 5 parents about the next practice. My understanding is those are public records, right? Because that was them acting in their position at the school district, putting out communication or making information about what they are doing to some members of through their work related activity.
I guess.
And the problem comes with using a private email, then trying to assess, because you don't have access to their private email. You cannot say that, yeah, we have it all, we don't have it all. Does it make some sense to say that we should have a general policy that if you're communicating with parents through one function or another of your position with the school district, you should be using a school email? You shouldn't be using a private email. And if we need to provide coaches or whoever, people who are more ancillary, don't work here full time with a school email, that doesn't seem like a major problem. And then we don't have an issue about, do we have access to those records?
I would
Say no.
Well, and that was a piece, maybe the co-curricular committee looked at this. One of the things that you saw on one of Aaron's goals is to make sure that we're all of our coaches are on the same platform. So, and by that mean you have different ways that we communicate with our teams and with parents. So if my daughter plays youth basketball, she's on Sports Engine. Sports Engine is, so this isn't involved with school, but it's something that a coach could utilize as a school team if they chose to. It was a process where now you have kind of a closed loop where parents can communicate about things and the coach can communicate to the parents. In a school setting, we have things that we purchase called like Huddle and other things that have these similar type of pieces. And we're trying to make sure that all of our staff either use, as Dave said, the school email or use a system that we as a school district provide. so that those records, if they're requested, because we've had situations like that in the past, that they're accessible. So making sure that so that's a conversation with particularly our coaches has already begun. I think it's also a piece to make sure that because it gets down to what Ted was talking about as well, is you can make comments on many different things. Doesn't mean that they're all related to them being a record of the school, even if what I'm talking about, if I was a coach and I'm posting things about sports. So obviously that could be just a piece that they're very interested in and engaged with, as opposed to being an official capacity of them being a coach communicating to their players or their families. That's where it gets, but there are things, to your point, Dave, we can do and should do from a communicative standpoint to help divide what these things are, either being from articulating it specifically about email. And in some of these pieces, making sure that you can clearly define which one is associated with this school event, if it's like an Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and which one of these are private. That is where you communicate specifically on your own, and those are your own thoughts. So,
And in a way, I would think it would help us with not only being able to quickly aid you in putting these things together without having to do as much tracking. But then also, if that staff member, for whatever reason, was doing something that was improper, the fact that they didn't do it on their school email helps also prove, or through the school system, does help us also say, well, that was them acting on their own. They violated our policy of how they were supposed to communicate, and they avoided it. And that helps make it a lot cleaner as to the school district's liability and responsibility over their actions. I think we do need to get that moving faster in a cleaner way.
I'm fine with the policy provisions. I think those are appropriate. There's a lot here. I think generally what they're stating is as I review them here today, that I think they're generally in line with what I think we need to be looking at. There are some decision points which I'm going to have to get a little bit more finer point to before I can tell you exactly what direction I think we might want to go. But I do think it's a policy that should get in front of the board as soon as we're able to. The other piece with regards to this is kind of the whole issue of fees. Now, fees are not simply something that you can just randomly assess. There's statutory language around what fees you can provide. I think it's anything under $50 that you pretty much need to provide, and if it goes in excess of that, then there's actually some language that you have to follow from a legal standpoint as far as which records you can charge for, which ones you can't, and then what are the parameters for how you put that fee schedule together. And so that was an example I was sharing with someone earlier, was if it was a record that was going to take a while to produce, but Rebecca could do it or I could do it, but I chose to do it in my position. Obviously, my salary is at a different level than Rebecca's are. I can't charge in mine. I have to charge it at the level of where it could have been addressed. So those are some of the examples of what it is. My practice has been up until now, and I do think it needs to be revised, but I'd like to make sure that the board's in line with it. I've generally viewed public records as something I've provided to people in the community. There is the ability to charge for them. I haven't, even some of the larger ones, they've taken a little bit longer to do, but we've worked through them. I do think that there's a piece where we need to talk about kind of when we get to those items that are legitimately able to be charged for, should we be putting forth a fee? And I think many districts do that. I haven't generally done that just as a community service piece, but given the volume of what we do receive, it's probably worth specifically taking a look at that, having a discussion about it so we're all on the same page.
The only thing I didn't like about that, the one written up there now, is that may charge. I think it's either charge or don't charge, so that it gets rid of that
I agree.
target of selective
For
charge.
me, I would just say will.
Yeah,
Yeah,
we're either gonna do it or we're not gonna do it.
That's right. I would agree with that. I guess what we could do with this one, I mean, there's a lot of pieces to this. There's a few areas in here where we do need to make some designations. I agree, it probably should go in front of the board sooner than later. I'm comfortable with it, generally with what the language is here, but I want to go through it, like I said, with a little finer lens. I could take it directly to the board out of here. If we want to bring it to another policy committee, we could just set that and do that. If you want to do it before
I think
the,
with that background you've given, I guess I'd like to go through it a little bit more, probably before it goes back to.
all right. Yeah, there's a lot here. And
Yeah.
This was a piece before I released the agenda. It came in minutes before we released it and then it went out.
Yeah.
No,
So
that's good.
there's a lot here. I
Right.
guess if what we would like to do is I can go through and kind of put some of my 2 cents to as far as what needs to be in there. Bring it back for us to review and then we move it forward from there. I'm happy to do that.
I like that.
Very good.
No motion neither, nothing, I guess we're done. That brings us to.
Motion to adjourn.
Or do you want to discuss this future meeting?
If I can just, future meetings, some other topics is looking at the next series. We talked about some things with regards to political speech in schools. There was a request, I think, Ted, you and I talked about kind of a clarification on social media use. And then I need to bring back, and that's spelled incorrectly, the seclusion and restraint policy from Tiffany as she was reviewing it from the legal lens. So that's kind of what our next meeting would look like. So to me, I guess, and then I would add this policy to it. I guess I wouldn't mind us looking at our calendars and seeing when we could come back together.
We also, or maybe not the very next meeting, but the one after that, the idea of some sort of requirement of communication with parents using school resources. I think we're gonna have to put that in a policy in order to get that.
What was that again? Sorry.
Include communication from coaches or parent or staff with parents and students has to be through school resources somehow. So that open records wise, we can actually have the materials. Have to chase private emails. I gotta admit, I don't know if we have that policy anywhere near that right now.
And I'll take a look at it. I think these are things we talked about with our staff. I mean, particularly when some parents really like to text to their teacher, particularly if you have a high needs child and there's communication daily, some of that comes here. We have told staff, this is something it's okay to have a text coming in saying, I'll see you at 3:45 so I can touch base with you, but anything of substance about the kids program shouldn't go through a text. For that exact reason is now you've created a pupil record of which we have to maintain somewhere to be able to track down. But let me look and see what we have in policy or procedures right now with regards to that, Dave, and I'll add that to that list. So over the next few meetings, this is kind of how we look. Looking at a time to meet, because I'm looking for your availability. Our board meeting in January is on the 10th. We return from break on the 3rd. I guess I'm looking at either the week of the 10th or the very beginning of the week of.
Well, I'm out of town from like the 13th through the 24th, so it's probably not without me, but
Well, we could do the 11th or the 12th.
Could
what we do.
how about the week before the board meeting? Is that too soon?
Yeah,
Yeah,
That's a
Okay.
little crazy.
we already got facilities and budget.
Can I suggest the 11th then? Or 11th, I think it could be,
The 11th, then you can pack up.
well, I'm not sure when we're leaving, but okay, the 11th would help me
That would be fine.
if we're having an afternoon meeting.
Is that okay, being right after the board meeting for you?
That's fine.
4 o'clock again?
I have my staff webinar that night.
Oh,
Ooh,
That's
So
you
you
at
want to have
5
5 o'clock?
5 o'clock, would that work?
oh, sure.
yeah,
Yeah, because I have my webinar of staff that night that I do.
5 PM on the 11th.
Okay.
Motion to adjourn.
second?
all in favor.
All right.
Aye.
Thanks all.
Thanks, Ryan.
Uh-huh. And thanks to the brownies.
Yeah.
Do we have a coconut?